you, Nancy. Thank you, Nancy. There you go. And Diana, I will turn to you, and I wondered if you could make that comparison, but also, did the times make a difference? I mean,
Yes.
we're many years later. How did that affect that?
Okay. Yeah, before I begin, I also want to thank everyone here at the Nixon Library and the Foundation, and Tamara, and I feel really privileged to have been a part of last year's symposium and also this one, and I just am thrilled with everything you're doing to highlight women and First Ladies this year. So I think there were several things that Eleanor Roosevelt and Betty Ford had in common, and it was a little like what you did with Heath and Rebecca. You don't automatically think of the two of them necessarily in the same breath, but they were both very independent women. They both had had careers, and they had to give up a lot for their husbands. As Nancy said, Eleanor was very worried about carving out a place because she had to give up her work. She had to give up her political activities. She was actually more politically involved than he was before he began running for office. And Betty Ford spent most of her time as a congressional wife, raising 4 children. And she had a very short period of time as second lady, but she learned a lot from Pat Nixon. And where there were some comparisons, I think, especially, were that they were both outspoken. And as Nancy said, Eleanor was ahead of her husband on the issues of civil rights, and she was very outspoken. Betty Ford was ahead of her husband and some members of his administration on women's rights. She was a very vocal advocate of the ERA. She was pro-choice. She had some pretty liberal views about child rearing, which she expressed in a 60 Minutes interview. Some of you may be old enough to remember that. And so, you know, they both were outspoken women. One of the other things she did that really channeled Eleanor was that she had a news conference 26 days after she became First Lady. She held a news conference, and it was really the first major news conference that a First Lady had had since Eleanor. You know, Truman apparently had a brief one where she answered one question with one word, and that was it. And Mamie didn't do much. And we really didn't have another First Lady who had a formal news conference, but hers differed from Eleanor's in that she had both women, as Eleanor only had women, and men at that news conference, and she held several of them. Betty was only First Lady for 30 months compared to 12 years for Eleanor. But what she did in that time was pretty phenomenal. She gave over 100 major speeches. And Eleanor was out giving speeches and doing everything else. She spoke to the media. I said she went on 60 Minutes. And the ERA, Eleanor was controversial in terms of what she was doing with the anti-lynching legislation, with some of the other legislation on civil rights. And Betty Ford was certainly controversial with her support of the ERA. There were protesters across from the White House wanting to muzzle her, and members of the cabinet wanted to do the same thing, and Eleanor had some of that going on. So some very interesting similarities. In fact, Betty had to install a private phone line that she paid for in the White House to lobby state legislators to pass the ERA. And people did not want her using tax dollars on a telephone line that was paid for by them on the ERA. And in the book that Nancy and Anita and I wrote, there is a photo of her sitting at her desk in the White House with a "Don't Tread on Me" flag in front of it, and she's making phone calls into state legislators. So you know, outspoken women, and in terms of the times, Ellen, you know, we now are into what we call the second wave of feminism. You have, you know, all of the women's rights advocates. This is Betty Friedan's book is out, Gloria Steinem. And this is the era in which Betty Ford is acting, whereas Eleanor is First Lady only, you know, less than 20 years after the 19th Amendment. And so we've had more time. We have women. We've had Nixon bringing women into all these positions, as we discussed last year. So women are far more visible in government than they had been during Eleanor's time. And Betty Ford really took advantage of that and took advantage of the women's movement, which was something that Eleanor did not have.
I have two quick follow-up questions. One, my curiosity. What was the one word that Bess Truman said? Was it yes or no?
It was no, I believe,
okay.
Yeah.
I have to go back and listen to that so-called press conference. I'm curious, both Betty Ford and Eleanor Roosevelt, as you said, could be quite controversial. how did that sit with their husbands as presidents? Yeah.
Well, both husbands sort of took the same approach, and Nancy might want to comment on this too. They basically said, I can't control my wife. That's pretty much it. And there were complaints to Gerald Ford about some of Betty's activities, and he said, you know, Betty sort of does what she's going to do, so take it up with her, don't talk to me. And there was, in 1975, it was the International Year of the Women, and there was a proclamation that was signed, and Betty, you know, was right there when he signed it, and he made some comment about, you know, hope this makes you happy sort of thing, and she was very much there. So they both kind of approached it the same way. Nancy, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
Well, I agree with Diana's point. I think that they sort of had plausible deniability, but importantly, both of them clearly supported what their wives were doing, or they would have pulled them in. The one difference I wanted to comment that I see in terms of Eleanor Roosevelt and Betty Ford and their approach to issues is that Betty Ford with breast cancer and then with alcohol and drug abuse, her approach was personal. And Eleanor's approach was not a personal, this is happening to me. Eleanor's approach was more reaching out and helping people who were having issues. And that is also probably a product of the times. While they had many similarities, I sort of see that as a stylistic difference between the two.
Before we turn to a document we're going to talk about in a moment, Heath and Anita, if you wanted to make any comments on the comparison of Eleanor and Betty, please jump in.
Go ahead, Anita.
Well, of course, these two remarkable women that you're talking about and listening to Diana and Nancy really give the breadth and depth of their contributions. I think one of the other differences or contrasts I'd like to make about Betty Ford, and particularly in the ERA, is, there were women in our country who were not supportive of what she was doing. And that was as we began to see a more, conservative approach by women, or a growing movement of conservative women who were not supporting the ERA. So that was certainly a factor that Betty Ford, and politically also the White House and the president had to deal with as he was inching towards an election. And that would be, something that the political operatives, of course, around the president would be worried about, the issue affecting voters, and not just male voters, but women voters too.
Heath, we cannot hear you.
Oh, excuse me, my fault. Off of mute. I'd love to comment about the ERA and Pat Nixon in terms of her support for that. That was part of the Republican platform from 1940 until 1980. So Mrs. Nixon strongly supported that. And I feel that she teed up things quite well for Betty Ford to take that ball and run with it. Now, Mrs. Nixon did not like comparisons to Eleanor Roosevelt, who she just didn't feel a kinship with. But I think they also had a lot in common, sort of just their approach to things, and particularly their approach to international diplomacy. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on.
Thank you, Heath. Now, I want to turn to, quickly, before we go into the next comparison, a document that Diana has brought for us. Regarding Betty Ford. So as you know, the National Archives is all about preserving and making available documents. Always called it the raw material of history. If you really want to understand history, that's where you go, to the archives. And so we wanted to make sure we wanted to highlight some documents or photos or artifacts today related to the First Ladies we're discussing. So, Diana.
Well, we could not do our work without the libraries and the National Archives. And Library of Congress for the earlier ones. I mean, it would be impossible for any of us to do any of the writing that we do without it. So I thank all the archivists out there who keep all of those records and make them accessible. There were so many when they asked us to choose one, it was hard to choose something. But for Betty Ford, the document that I wanted to highlight was the text, and you can find it on the Gerald R. Ford Library website, of her 1975 International Women's Year speech in Cleveland, Ohio. And I think this says a lot about Betty, and I just want to read a little excerpt of it. And she was talking about women needing to make choices, and she basically said she had given up a career and she made a choice to be a homemaker, and that was work, and that women needed to be honored for whatever they chose to do. And Nancy, I think that was part of that political instinct that she had to know that not every woman agreed with what was going on with the feminist movement. But she talked about the restrictions on women, and she said many of these restrictions spring directly from those emotional ideas about what women can and should do. These definitions of behavior and ability inhibit men and women alike, another astute political comment. But the limits on women have been formalized into law and structured into social custom. For that reason, the first important steps have been to undo the laws that hem women in and lock them out of the mainstream of opportunities. But my own support of the Equal Rights Amendment has shown what happens when a definition of proper behavior collides with the right of an individual to personal opinions. I do not believe that being First Lady should prevent me from expressing my views, and Eleanor felt the same way. I spoke out on this important issue because of my deep personal convictions. Why should my husband's job or yours prevent us from being ourselves? Being ladylike does not require silence.
That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Well, we finished our first set of comparisons. On to the next two Texans, Lady Bird Johnson and Laura Bush. Both Lady Bird and Laura Bush were first ladies during times of tragedy and war. So my question to our panel is, how did they address that reality in their work? And how do you see similarities and differences in how they did that? And I think I'm going to turn first to Nina McBride.
All right, well, thank you, Alan. Thank you, everyone, for being there. You're coming from the wonderful East Room. I love that at the Nixon Library. It makes it so special. No one else has that. And it is like Diana, it's a joy to join you, the Nixon Library and Foundation, for the second time on this symposium that you do in March. You know, the difference, the most obvious difference, of course, for Laura Bush and Lady Bird Johnson, in particularly the time of war, was, you know, when the Johnsons came into the White House, the war in Vietnam had already been going on since 1955. I mean, that was an element of the Cold War. The obvious difference, of course, in the Bushes came into the White House, came in intending to focus on domestic issues. Education reform was at the top of the list. Immigration reform was something George Bush wanted to work on. Laura Bush, as a literacy and education expert herself, was fully invested in working on the education reform issues and had led a lot of the reforms in Texas as well. So when the United States was attacked on 9/11, 2001, of course, which was a moment of incredible shock and grief in our country. And then within weeks, of course, the war in Afghanistan is launched. She immediately, and President Bush too, became wartime president and first lady. Not at all what they had expected. And remembering in that week leading up to 9/11 as well, Laura Bush had just presided over two things where she thought this is how her life in the White House was going to be. She had just successfully had her first National Book Festival, an initiative that she brought with her from Texas as Texas First Lady, had launched the Texas Book Festival, still going on, by the way, a great example of legacy. So the first National Book Festival on the National Mall in partnership with the Library of Congress had just happened. It was enormously successful. Also, the first state dinner that the Bushes had planned and had hosted. The president of Mexico, Vicente Fox, and his wife, Marta. And again, that was a focus on the President Bush had come into office talking about wanting to focus on the Western Hemisphere, wanting to focus on immigration. So this beautiful state dinner, a wonderful National Book Festival. It was also one of the most beautiful weeks of weather that we had in Washington. And so all of these outdoor events were perfection. And then within days, the nation is attacked within the worst terrorist attack in our country. And she's thrust into being a wartime first lady. Incidentally, had been up on the Hill about to do congressional briefing on her early childhood education summit that she had hosted just a month before. She was quite nervous about doing that, unlike Lady Bird Johnson, who was very comfortable as a communicator, as a spokesperson. Of course, and Nancy will be able to tell you, of course, she owned radio stations in Texas. She knew how to communicate. Laura Bush was a quieter, behind the scenes interlocutor. And so this morning for her on Capitol Hill was a big deal. And she was nervous about it. Then, of course, it got postponed immediately because on her way up to the Hill that morning, the second plane had hit the second tower. Before she had left the White House that morning, the first plane had hit the first tower, and like everyone else in the country, thought it was a horrible accident, not knowing, of course, that the country was going to be at war within a matter of minutes. So that morning was completely not what was expected, not what the day was planned to be. This was an education day for the White House. The president was in Florida to do an education event. Laura Bush, again, showing the coordination between president and first lady, East Wing and West Wing. She was up on the Hill to talk education. This was highly orchestrated and planned. But of course, when you're in the White House, you can't plan for everything. And you certainly can't plan for a tragedy like this. But she had to respond to it, waited for the president to speak first from that classroom in Florida before she gave her first words of comfort to the nation. And I think that's something that is similar about Laura Bush and Lady Bird Johnson, that their ability to connect with people, comfort people in a time of tragedy. Nancy will talk about how Mrs. Johnson, of course, was thrust into being First Lady at a horrible time of tragedy for the country with President Kennedy's assassination. But I will say this about Laura Bush and Lady Bird Johnson. When asked who her favorite First Lady was, Laura Bush would always say Lady Bird Johnson. She drew such an example of strength and grace from her. Now, she was quick to follow up with that to say, of course, notwithstanding my own mother-in-law, Barbara Bush, of course, certainly while Barbara was alive, Mrs. Bush was careful to say that, President Bush too. But these two Texas First Ladies are incredibly strong women with no pretensions.
Thank you, Anita. Nancy, please tell us your perspective on Lady Bird.
Well, I think Anita has summed it up very well. I do want to say that Lady Bird's first years were more defined by the assassination, by her walking on a stage she says she was not prepared for. Never mind, she had been the wife of a congressman, a senator, a Senate majority leader, and a vice president. And outside of Pat Nixon, there were few people who had that much experience. But she was really, in 1963, focused on doing anything she could do to support Jackie Kennedy. She immediately hired Liz Carpenter as the first professional press secretary and buttressed the press function of the First Lady. In 1963, she hired Liz. And to this day, I believe Mrs. Johnson is the only First Lady who had a degree in journalism, who owned radio and TV stations, and who really knew how to communicate with the press and brought them in terms of publicizing her programs and creating neat events like going rafting in the Rio Grande, and then even helping a reporter who fell off the raft. But the tragedy that she came into, it's very interesting. She was very much not willing, like Pat Nixon. She was pressed right away. What are your uh, projects, your focus going to be? And she said, my focus is going to be to help my family and Mrs. Kennedy deal with this huge tragedy. It was only in 1964 that she began to define and set the precedent for modern first ladies of defining projects. And of course, in her case, it was beautification and conservation, education, and a very important and evolutionary trip she made in October of 1964 to support the Civil Rights Act in her part of the South. She went through 8 southern states, gave over 47 speeches in the small towns of the South on the whistle stop train, which they had to run a train beforehand because they thought it would be bombed. It was a very dangerous trip to say that they really needed to accept civil rights and to get this yoke off their back. And she was very courageous and, in fact, prevented the fear that Lyndon Johnson and the Democrats had of the Southern Democrats bolting from the party. She also, in terms of beautification and environment, not only operated in beautifying the nation's capital, she supported a Highway Beautification Act of 1965, and she importantly gave a very important speech at Williams and Yale universities in 1967. Now, in that speech, you can see by 1967, the war in Vietnam has become so unpopular. You can see a result in impact of the Vietnam War with her program. And I'm going to quote a very interesting section from her diary, which is of that October day. In the evening, she says, how would I evaluate a day spent like that? Probably a mistake on balance, because what I had really done was to provide a vehicle for the dissenters, who were a minority, to mount a platform, to get inches in the paper and minutes on the screen that they would not have gotten without me. So I was their bait, their creature for the day. How did I personally feel as I walked amongst the picketers? Cool and firm and determined to maintain dignity. But through every pore, you sense a sort of animal passion right below the surface. So after that 1967 speech on the environment at those 2 universities, she really did not do a lot of public speaking. One other point I want to stress is that she was the first lady to record her time in real time in the White House. She would record every few days her activities. And in 1971, she published her White House diary, which was a book showing what she did as First Lady and her impressions. And that set the modern precedent for memoirs by First Ladies. It also showed her love of history, Abigail Adams being her one of her favorite first ladies. So she did so much. And the last point I will make is that Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson never came into the presidency, I mean, in the awful way they did, thinking that it was going to be about foreign policy. Lyndon Johnson wanted to be a domestic president, and Lady Bird Johnson wanted her programs to focus domestically. But as Anita and I will say, and anyone who studies history, what presidents and first ladies do are affected by what happens during their times. So that, and finally, they were, both Flora and Lady Bird were true Texans, and they had that independent but polite sort of way of handling things in a controlled fashion. If they weren't Southwestern, I would say they truly defined steel magnolias.
Anita, perhaps you want to comment. I know after 9/11, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, both the President and Mrs. Bush did a lot of work with military service members and veterans as well.
Sure, and we're forever, and in fact, the president to this day, and Mrs. Bush too, one of the major initiatives at the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas is the Military Service Initiative. President Bush knew that would he put, men and women in harm's way in a long, difficult war, and even beyond the physical wounds of war, the invisible wounds of war that they face. And this initiative at the Bush Center, both the Bushes continue to be very involved and engaged in helping our military and our veterans recover, because they are still trying to recover. But often, of course, as all presidents and first ladies, as commander-in-chief and spouse of the commander-in-chief, I mean, this is a thread of continuity for all of them to be devoted to the men and women who put themselves in harm's way for the rest of us. I think the other thing too that I'd like to mention, where the Bushes were very close to the Flight 93 families as well, met with them often at the White House, on the road at Shanksville, something that, they, again, as President Bush had said, these were the first heroes in the war on terror. And both President and Mrs. Bush felt very connected to them. Alan,
Thank you,
I didn't
Anita.
know
I know
if...
I'm taking a look
Yeah,
at
go
our
ahead.
clock back here. Keeping on
Yeah.
time, I want to make
Yeah.
sure we turn to our documents and artifacts for this section,
Sure.
because we have a couple actually. Anita, I
Sure.
want to turn to you first. The great photos of
Oh, sure.
Mrs. Bush with Senator Kennedy. Can you talk about that and what
Right.
stories those tell?
Sure, I'll just quickly tell you about that. And I think the best way for me to describe it is in her own words from her book, Spoken from the Heart. This is real quick, but I think it conveys what you're seeing in those two images. First of all, this beautiful painting of daffodils that President Kennedy had painted for Mrs. Bush, dated September 11th, 2001, that he gave to her as a gift when she came to that briefing that day. And then the other picture, of him, her looking at it. And I'll just quickly say this from her book. Senator Kennedy was waiting to greet me according to plan. We both knew when we met that the towers had been hit, and without a word being spoken, knew there would be no briefing that morning. But together we walked the short distance to his office. He began by presenting me with this limited edition print. It was a vase of bright daffodils, a copy of a painting he had created for his wife, Victoria, and had given to her on their wedding day. And the print was inscribed for me, dated September 11th, 2001. An old television was turned on in the corner of the room, and I glanced over to see the plumes of smoke billowing from the Twin Towers. Senator Kennedy kept his eyes averted from the screen. Instead, he led me on a tour of his office, pointing out pictures, furniture, pieces of memorabilia. I have often wondered if the small talk that morning was Ted Kennedy's defense mechanism, if after so much tragedy, the combat death of his oldest brother in World War II, the assassinations of his brothers Jack and Robert, and the deaths of nephews, including John Jr., whose body he had to identify when it was pulled from the cold, dark waters off Martha's Vineyard. If after all those things, he simply could just not look upon another grievous tragedy. It just is a remarkable statement about these two people facing this moment in our history together.
Really is, and I know at the Bush Museum, which if you haven't been, please go to Dallas and see that. We have that photo up as you go into the 9/11 section, and we use that to tell a lot of stories. There, obviously, the story of Mrs. Bush, her role, her focus on education, the bipartisan nature of that, but also 9/11 and the glass on that picture when it was finally sent to the White House weeks later is discolored, because it went through a process that was after the anthrax
Radiation.
attacks. Remember those? So it also helps tell that story of that other tragedy in our history. So thank you, Anita. Nancy, I know you have a document, Lady Bird Johnson letter to LBJ in advising him about his run in '64.
Yes, being an archivist for 44 years at the National Archives, I do want to say the documents, the tapes that we do have, and the photographs, the audio visual are just incredible. And certainly we relied on them heavily in our book. The letter that Alan is talking about is Mrs. Johnson. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson was very depressed. He thought with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in July of 1964 that he could not be elected. And in August, right before the convention, he had talked with Mrs. Johnson and several other key aides about announcing that he was going to withdraw. So Mrs. Johnson writes him a letter, which is quite an incredible letter. I don't have it in front of me, but I think it is on your screen, which she annotates as personal and basically tells Lyndon she will support him in whatever he does, but that his friends would be frozen and think he was a coward if he didn't run, and that she really feels he needs to run and agenda. And later on, she, not in this letter, but she tells him she wants him to run in 1964, but not in 1968. And in an oral history I did with Mrs. Johnson in 1987, she told me that one of the things she was most proud about was giving Lyndon Johnson the advice to run in 1964, which she said immediately ended his qualms about whether he should run, and then telling him he should not run in 1968. Now, Alan, I don't know if you want me to talk about the other item.
Sure, Nancy. I'll give you 1 minute, 20 seconds.
Well, the other item is a fascinating item. It is one that we can't show because Mrs. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy's handwriting is copyrighted. But 2 days after the assassination, really 3 days, Mrs. Kennedy's still in the White House. Jackie Kennedy's still in the White House. She invites Mrs. Johnson to tea. Mrs. Johnson lives at the Elms and comes to see what she thinks is Jackie going over household things. She comments on how beautiful and composed Jackie looks just 3 days after the assassination. And instead, Jackie Kennedy has a 7-page, on legal type, handwritten letter telling Mrs. Johnson that she would like her to carry on her White House restoration efforts, complete them, and set up a permanent committee in the White House for First Ladies to push White House restoration. Mrs. Johnson was very surprised, and she told me in my interview with her that that was not White House restoration was not going to be one of her main projects because she didn't feel comfortable in that world. But when Jackie asked her, she definitely did it. And as far as Anita and Diana and I know, that is the only time a first lady has asked another first lady to carry on a project. Mrs. Johnson did, and President Johnson in March of 1964 made the White House curator a permanent part of the White House staff and created the Committee for the Preservation of the White House, which every First Lady since then has headed up, and which gives gets advice from the White House Historical Association and gives advice in terms of what they would like to purchase for the White House. So that was such an incredible moment in history where Jackie has the presence of mind to make sure that what she wants is completed. And there are wonderful other letters of Jackie thanking Mrs. Johnson for carrying this effort on and completing it.
Thank you, Nancy, and we'll learn more about that in panel 2. Before we move on, I'll just say one thing. If you haven't listened to the Johnson tapes, we certainly owe Lady Bird Johnson, people like Harry Middleton, a great debt for getting those tapes released early. An amazing record of history. Go online and listen to the LBJ tapes. Really tremendous. All right, with that, we're on schedule. I'm very excited. Our last set of comparisons between Pat Nixon, of course, and Rosalyn Carter. So here's my question. The personalities of Pat Nixon and Rosalyn Carter seem similar in that they were both a bit more reserved than others, like a Betty Ford or later like a Michelle Obama. How did that characteristic influence how they achieved and how they communicated their goals as First Lady? I'm going to turn to you first, Heath.
Sure. Oh, and this is a great question. I am not an expert on Mrs. Carter, so I'm going to turn most of that over to Diana, who is. But I will say something Nancy said earlier about steel magnolias, I think applies well here, though I would say Mrs. Nixon is kind of a desert rose, perhaps a Western rose, and then Mrs. Carter is the Southern steel magnolia. They both had this core strength and real commitment to integrity, their ethics. This drives both of them, I think, in a very similar way. I think they are both more retiring, perhaps, than some other first ladies, for instance, Betty Ford, but both are very strong proponents, of course, of women's rights in different ways, but both supporting the ERA, of course, getting more women into government. And then also Mrs. Carter takes a lot of the things that Lady Bird Johnson and then Mrs. Nixon, also Mrs. Carter, the East Wing, and Anita can really speak to this well, but shaping the East Wing. And I give Mrs. Carter real credit for that. And maybe Anita can jump in and talk about that in a bit, but she is the one who really gets the East Wing formalized. There is money, there is budget. That is thanks to Mrs. Carter. But to turn to Mrs. Nixon and just give a little background, Secretary Franklin gave you such a wonderful overview. I'm not going to go over all the many things that Pat Nixon did, but I do think she comes up as part of the Pat and Dick team. So she is on a team with her husband. She is supporting him from 1946 on when he wins his first election through the Senate election in 1950. And then, of course, is second lady from 1953 to 1961, and then first lady from 1969 to 1974. So I think also, like Lady Bird Johnson, she is one of our best prepared first ladies. She is so well trained by the time she gets to being first lady. She's ready to go and has, some people have tried to say when I was writing my book, you know, she really doesn't come into her own until 1970 with Peru. I would dispute that. I think she has her foundation well set very early on. However, I think as First Lady, she tends to pull back a little bit more in terms of she is not setting policy. That is not something she wants to do or feels that it is her place to do. So she is a very much of a behind the scenes person. I think like Laura Bush too, they are in the background, they are helping, but they are not out announcing policy. That's just not their style, and they don't feel they're elected to do that. But that does not mean they don't influence their husbands and policy, particularly about things they care about. With Mrs. Bush, of course, literacy, so important. That's also something with Pat Nixon she was very interested in under the umbrella of, people are my project. There wasn't just one signature project with Pat Nixon. She wanted to take on many projects. And I really liked how she evaded both the media and what one author has called the beardless image types in the West Wing, who were trying to force her into this signature project mode, which she did not like. Also with Rosalyn Carter, international diplomacy, so huge for both Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Nixon. Now, my documents that I wanted us to look at, which I think will be, you can scan with the QR code and see, are photographs. I think so often photographs are worth 1,000 words, as much as I love archives. So I have a picture of Mrs. Nixon in Peru, the great Peruvian earthquake in 1970, when she goes to Peru as the president's solo global ambassador and bringing food, humanitarian supplies, medical supplies. She's the first lady to act as a global solo ambassador, though many shout outs are due to Eleanor Roosevelt for really pioneering that concept. But Mrs. Nixon is the first official global solo ambassador. Then she also goes to Africa, and we've talked a little bit about this, where she's the first lady to speak to a foreign parliament in Ghana and the first lady to go to Africa. Soft diplomacy is something we haven't talked about yet, but it is critical here with all these first ladies, both at home and abroad. And in this case, Mrs. Carter is also so good at this, and all our first ladies really are. They help seal the deals with soft diplomacy. Mrs. Nixon also, we cannot not mention the pandas, panda diplomacy in China in 1972. She goes with her husband to China for that groundbreaking trip, is given a pair of pandas by the Chinese premier. And this, even today, this is our barometer of Chinese American diplomacy. Then, of course, women's rights, and Secretary Franklin talked about Mrs. Nixon supporting her behind the scenes. And if you read my book, there is quite a bit about Secretary Franklin and her huge contributions there. But it was Mrs. Nixon pushing behind the scenes to help Secretary Franklin get more women into higher levels of government, into mid-levels of government, into roles they had never had before, like FBI agents, tugboat captains, forest rangers. So, and I will not talk about the third point I wanted to make, because the next panel is going to tell you about the White House restoration and renovation project. But I will say Mrs. Nixon brought more art and period objects, over 600, than any first lady before or since her time. So she is very important in those efforts, and you'll hear a lot more in the next panel about that. But I am going to turn it over to Diana to talk more about Mrs. Carter.
Things that Anita mentioned was military, and this thread that goes all the way back to the Washingtons. And one of the things when Anita and Nancy and I were working on our book, Remember the First Ladies, is that we saw these threads, and that one first lady sets up the stage for the next. And Heath, you're absolutely right that, Pat Nixon followed in the footsteps of some of those earlier first ladies. And Rosalyn Carter really took up the mantle that Pat Nixon had started on ERA and women's rights, which Betty Ford then pushed. And so and then you have three first ladies who are really activists on the issue of the ERA and women's rights and getting more women into government positions and the judiciary. So she really kind of followed that trend that Pat had started. And then diplomacy, international diplomacy was definitely something that Pat Nixon paved the way for. Eleanor Roosevelt had gone to Guadalcanal, but she was not doing the same. I mean, she was there to support the troops. But what Pat Nixon did, as he said, was she represented her husband before foreign governments. And shortly after Jimmy Carter became president, he tasked Rosalyn with going to 7 Latin American countries and representing him. She took Spanish, she went to the State Department and was briefed, she went to the National Security Council, and she had talking points for every one of these 7 leaders who she was meeting with. Some of them didn't take her seriously. They were, you know, planning all these little teas with their wives and all, and she said, no, I'll go to those, but that's not why I'm here. And she was able, during that tour, to do a lot of what Pat Nixon did. You know, you mentioned, Heath, that the photo that was up when we started of Pat Nixon dressed up in her heels and tights and this beautiful suit, climbing over rubble in Peru. And we'd had a terrible relationship with Peru. And when she asked to go and deliver the foreign aid and was seen by the people of Peru and the First Lady of Peru, you know, the president honored her, gave her a special citation. The media was talking about it. And they said, you know, the president, when he gave her this award, you know, told Pat Nixon, the president could have sent his entire Air Force down here to deliver this, but by sending his wife, he made a statement. And that's exactly what Rosalynn Carter did. Jimmy Carter made a statement. And since the beginning, this has been a 2-person job. And these were 2 women who really understood that. They campaigned for their husbands, but where there is a difference is in their relationship with their husbands when they were in the presidency. As Heath's book so well explains, Pat was a campaigner. She was out there from every campaign. Rosalynn Carter was the same. But Pat was pushed out of the way and put into her own lane. Rosalynn Carter's lane was side by side with her husband. And even if the staff maybe didn't like it, this was the way they operated. She had weekly lunches with him. If you all, those of you once again who are old enough, remember Rosalynn was criticized for sitting in on cabinet meetings. Pat would never have done that. And so you saw that there was this relationship. She did have her issue, mental health. And like Eleanor, she testified before Congress on that legislation. She got involved in policy, as Lady Bird had, but even more directly than any First Lady had done prior to that. So they, you know, once again, they build on what the other First Ladies have done. And as Heath mentioned, Rosalynn Carter said that the biggest fights, and Jimmy Carter wrote this in his memoir also, that the 2 of them had in their 70-some years of marriage were over the staffing in her office. And he ran to cut down the size of the executive branch. And he gave her all these responsibilities, and she said, I can't do that unless you give me more staff. And there was finally legislation passed to officially recognize the office, and she was the first Lady to have an office in the East Wing. These women were working out of their dressing rooms. They did not have a physical office in the power structure of the White House, which is pretty amazing until Rosalynn. So that was a big change even from Pat.
Now, I know Heath talked about her document. You also had provided photos. I'm not sure if they made it on the QR code. If not, we can certainly make those available. But you also had some wonderful,
I had
photos.
A lot of wonderful documents. I wrote an article for the White House Historical Quarterly that the White House Historical Association does on First Ladies and Sesame Street. And this is where Pat Nixon and then Rosalynn Carter followed right with her, and Betty Ford invited Big Bird and some of the other Sesame Street characters to the White House. And the Nixons were integral in getting Sesame Street started and were big supporters. And so Pat Nixon was really a first in using popular culture as a First Lady to promote an issue. And so the photo I had was of her standing next to Big Bird, holding one of his feathers that fell off. And it's there in the museum. I saw it yesterday and took a picture of it. But that was one. And then that other photograph that we also had in our book of her climbing over that rubble, I think. But the photographs in the archives are just wonderful because they do tell a major story.
They do. That's, again, one of the many great resources at the Presidential Libraries. Some people have said, by the way, that the character of Grouch is modeled on me. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it's possible. It's possible. I'll go ahead
I
and
don't
claim
believe
it.
that.
I'll buy that.
Anita and Heath, would you like to make comments on Pat Nixon and or Rosalyn Carter?
Two quick things. First of all, I adore Mrs. Nixon and just the strength and serenity and example that she is for all first ladies, really, and for our country, and as a diplomat, as someone who cared about people, just a misunderstood, misrepresented. But thanks to Heath and others, ourselves included, we want her story to be told. And I think it's being told quite effectively. The other thing I will just say on Mrs. Carter, I'm just a personal beneficiary for what she helped to create in 1978 with the pushing for the passing of the White House Personnel Authorization Act, which really codified a official office of First Lady. And the structure of the White House, I can't tell you how important that is to have a budget associated with it. Although even to this day, the staff of the First Lady are still considered staff of the President, assigned to the First Lady, because of course she's not the elected official. But putting that structure in place, having a policy director and projects director, really a precursor to a chief of staff position, which I was so privileged to hold. There wasn't a moment that I did not, appreciate her willingness to have that fight with her husband in order to have an official, office for a First Lady staff and for her herself.
Smith,
Yes,
as
and
is
I would
often the way,
add-
you have the last word on this topic.
I would just like to say that on Pat Nixon riding up to the Hill with Lady Bird Johnson, and when the Nixons were coming in, the next day she makes a comment to Julie Nixon that she was so impressed with how controlled and polite Mrs. Johnson was in the car, and that it must have taken great control. So I see a similarity there between Pat Nixon and Lady Bird in that they were both very controlled. And then on Rosalyn, I just wanted to say a demonstration of her close relationship with Jimmy is that Rosalyn tells the story that before Jimmy becomes president, right after he's elected, she, I believe, is in California, and she's asked by a reporter, what is she going to do? And she says she's going to chair the Committee on Mental Health, the Commission on Mental Health. And then Rosalyn laughs in telling this story and says she flew home to tell Jimmy she was going to chair the Commission on Mental Health. So that's a little demonstration of their relationship.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm going to ask a question of the panel as we close out here that I haven't told you I was going to ask, and if you don't have an answer right now, that's fine. But I'm curious. I found this such an illuminating way to look at the evolution of office of the First Lady. If we did this again in the future, would there be a pair of First Ladies you say you should compare this First Lady with that one? That would help us better understand the office and the evolution of it.
That's interesting.
Diana.
Well, one comparison that I've already made, and it's in an article again in White House Historical Quarterly, is their backgrounds, their personal backgrounds, because some of these women had some similar backgrounds. So Martha Washington, Julia Grant, and Mamie Eisenhower. And what they had in common was they were generals' wives, and they had this military experience. So that would be kind of an interesting one, I think, to look at.
I love that. Other panelists, any thoughts? I know it's unfair of me to do this to you, but anyone's in particular?
Well, given that Nancy, Diana, and I were just in Quincy, Massachusetts, talking about at the new Adams Presidential Center and talking about Abigail Adams and Louisa Adams. I think, again, as another, and then maybe Barbara Bush and Laura Bush as a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, first ladies, although obviously the obvious difference, Abigail Adams didn't live to see her son become president. But these four women hold a unique place in history, and that could be an interesting topic too.
Things
I know
that
Mrs.
Nancy picked up on when we were in Quincy
Yep.
was Louisa helped John Quincy become president, and then she was pushed out. And Nancy said, "Ooh, this sounds a lot like Pat Nixon." So that might be an interesting comparison.
Yes,
Yeah.
that would be an interesting
Nancy?
comparison. I think maybe even the older first ladies, for example, like Abigail Adams, and in comparison between Abigail Adams and Lady Bird Johnson, or Abigail Adams and her more recent first lady, would be very interesting because Abigail left such an incredible record. And I know in the case of Lady Bird, but I believe in other more recent first ladies, what she thought and what she did had an incredible impact on first ladies. And I think that comparison would be interesting because it really hasn't been done.
I'd like to see
Diana?
one,
And I want
Alan,
Heath.
with
Yeah, Heath.
Yeah, if I could interject, I would love to see when Mrs. Nixon loved Dolly Madison and really admired her and thought she just always talked about what a colorful character she was with her turbans. And, she would sit and even smoke with foreign diplomats, which and Mrs. Nixon would never be caught smoking, even though she did like her cigarettes. She would never be caught smoking with diplomats or anyone else, as I said in my book. But I do think in terms of being a wartime first lady, there's some interesting comparisons to be made there between Mrs. Nixon, who also was a wartime first lady during Vietnam, as so many of our Lady Bird, of course. I mean, even Mrs. Ford, it drags on the Vietnam Wars going on so long, Jackie Kennedy. A wartime of a more contemporary time period first lady, and of course Dolly Madison right in the beginning of our country. I think that would be very interesting, and also for the two of them to compare notes on their soft diplomacy, how they both handled that. Dolly was so good at that, as was Mrs. Nixon. So I think that would also be a very interesting comparison.
Diana, you had one more?
Sarah Polk, who no one knows anything about,
Sarah Polk.
and Hillary Clinton.
Mm.
Yeah, I hear some ahs. The way when I talk about Sarah Polk with my students or in, any programs I give, I say, Sarah Polk was Hillary before the television age. And one of the most powerful first ladies we have ever had. But she got away with a lot that you could not get away with during a television age or a media age.
She is an amazing woman, and James K. Polk, if you get to know me, which I hope you will, I'm obsessed with him a little bit, so I'll be glad to tell you about James K. Polk. Some great stuff out there on Sarah Polk as well. One thing I would say in closing is don't forget Mary Lincoln. I'd love to talk about Mary
course.
and first ladies
Very
in time of
important.
war. I think it'd be interesting to do first ladies in times of the Cold War as well. I think it may be something we do down the road. I'm seeing all kinds of good American FLOTUS episodes here, ladies. So.
Yay.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So please, thank you all for being here today, and join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Diana, Nancy, Heath.
And thank you. I think now we're going to a break, and then we'll be back for the next panel. Thank you all very much.
Bye, all.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, our program begins in 2 minutes. Please take your seats. Our program begins in 2 minutes. Please take your seats.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. Please take your seats as we begin our second panel of the day. And it is my delight to introduce Lena Mann, the moderator of this panel, titled The People's House. Lena is a historian with the White House Historical Association, where she began as a fellow in 2017 and joined as a historian in 2020. She's interested in many different aspects of White House history, including her latest research on the enslaved individuals that built, lived, and worked in the White House. Today, she'll lead our exploration of White House restoration and collections over time, highlighting, of course, Pat Nixon's remarkable efforts and contributions to renovate and enhance the People's House. Please join me in welcoming Lena Mann and our great panelists for our second panel of the day.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, and welcome to our People's House panel. And yes, we are going to be talking about the White House restoration, some about the decoration and collections over time, and then of course, we are going to highlight First Lady Pat Nixon's work to restore and renovate the White House and add to its legacy. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists this morning. First, we have Dr. Matthew Costello. He is the Chief Education Officer and Director of the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History and holds the Marlene Sexton Chair in White House History. Joined the association in 2016 after completing his PhD and MA at Marquette University. And his first book, The Property of the Nation, George Washington's Tomb, Mount Vernon, and the Memory of the First President, was published by the University Press of Kansas and was a finalist for the 2020 George Washington Book Prize. He also co-edited and contributed a chapter to the volume Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture, published by the University of Virginia Press. Next, I'd like to introduce, a little bit out of order, Bob Bostock. He is the consultant to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library Foundation. He has curated and authored numerous special exhibits for the Nixon Library, including the Pat Nixon Centennial Exhibit, People Were Her Project. He has also written on Mrs. Nixon's tenure as First Lady for the White House Historical Association and appeared on its History Happy Hour program discussing Mrs. Nixon's work to expand the collection. Next, in the middle here, I'd like to introduce Robert. Robert has been a journalist for 3 decades, and his work has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Smithsonian Magazine, where he is a regular contributor. And he is the author of 3 critically acclaimed books, including The Hidden White House, Harry Truman, and the Reconstruction of America's Most Famous Residents. And then finally, joining us virtually, we have Patrick Philip Schrock. He is an Iowa native and has been a White House scholar since viewing Jacqueline Kennedy's television tour in 1962 as an 11-year-old boy. As an educator for over 50 years, he has made a career teaching world languages, history, and theater, and was a curator for Terrace Hill, the Iowa governor's mansion, until his move to central Portugal. He is the author of The White House, an illustrated architectural history, and the Nixon White House Acquisition and Redecoration Program. It is such a delight to welcome all of these very accomplished panelists. As a historian of the White House myself, I have read each of their books and their articles, so it is very, very much my delight to be able to talk with you all today. All right. So I want to start with Bob this morning to get a little taste of Pat Nixon. We've been talking about her a bit this morning, and Barbara Franklin opened with that statement, people were her project, people are my project. Can you talk a bit about what Pat Nixon meant by this, and how does it relate to the People's House?
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Nixon Library and the Nixon Foundation. I've had the honor of appearing here last year on this panel remotely from New Jersey. When I was invited back this year, I thought, you know, we've had the coldest winter in the East in 10 years. I'm going to come and get some California sunshine. And my wife texted me, it's actually nicer back in New Jersey today than it is here. And I hope she didn't say that just because I'm not there, so we'll see. But Mrs. Nixon, when she talked about people being her project, she really meant that from her heart. On her gravestone out by the birthplace, it says, even when people can't speak your language, they know when you have love in your heart. And she really did have love in her heart for people everywhere. With respect to the White House, what she wanted to do was make it more accessible to people, both physically accessible and just more opportunities for people to come and see the People's House. She started the garden tours, which are still ongoing. The next one, the spring garden tour, is occurring next month at the White House, where people can go and tour the South grounds and see the Jacqueline Kennedy garden and the Rose garden, and usually they get to go into the house and see some of the state rooms. She developed tours for people who were visually impaired, allowing those groups to come in on special tours where they could actually touch many of the historic objects that were in the house and learn about them in that way, which is so important when someone has a visual impairment. She put in ramps for folks in wheelchairs or had difficulty navigating stairs. A ramp at the East Wing, which is where visitors come in to tour the house, and then one at the North Portico, so that when they were done touring the house, they could go down that ramp. She created many brochures in foreign languages, not English, to describe the White House, because so many of the visitors to the White House are from foreign countries who do not necessarily have English as their first language. She developed brochures in those languages so people could get a sense of the White House. She started during Christmas time candlelight tours of the White House in the evening, because she recognized that the folks who live in the Washington area at Christmas time or in December, you know, not a lot of tourists in DC in December, but the people who worked in the federal government couldn't come see the White House during the day, so she started nighttime Christmas tours, candlelight Christmas tours with the Marine Band playing carols and songs, and very, very popular, and those continued for quite a few years. I think they continued up until 9/11, when the security at the White House became much tighter. So when she talked about people being her project, it was not just when she was out and about touring the country or visiting other countries, but also in the White House itself, and made it possible for more people to see the house, to appreciate aspects of the house that you don't normally see on the regular tour, and to really get a sense, as she said, she wanted people to get a sense of pride in our history and in our country, and the more people who could do that, the better it was as far as she was concerned.
Excellent. So I wanted to open with that little bit about Pat Nixon, because now we have to go back and take us through a little journey through time in order to get up to Pat Nixon. So I first want to briefly start with the 19th century. Matt, I was wondering if you could discuss the 19th century White House and any structural changes that may have happened during the 19th century. Big question.
Yes, I'll try to be as concise as possible with this
But you know, we're going to hear about some of the later restoration and renovations. But the White House was always sort of a perpetual work in progress. And oftentimes when presidents or first ladies or first families came to the White House, you know, we hear these accounts of what the building looked like. They were generally not positive assessments in terms of the furnishings, in terms of the decor. And a big part of that was the Congress appropriated only so much money per administration for furniture and furnishings. And it wasn't a particularly large amount. And so presidents and first ladies oftentimes had to bring personal items with them to help fill out this massive space. Or they would auction off historic furnishings at a local auction house in Washington, D.C., take those funds and purchase new things. This is a big part of why the White House collection today, you'll hear stories of things being returned to the White House, returning to the collection, and that's because that's really how these artifacts and objects passed through the White House for, you know, about 150 years or so, 160 years. And so what we have is a 19th century house that is burned in the War of 1812. It is rebuilt very quickly by James Hoban and his crew, but in order to maximize the efficiency of that and getting the building open, they do make some changes in terms of the interior structure and support. Hoban opts to use more wood and more wood beams throughout for the interiors. And eventually, as more and more renovations are done throughout the 19th century, additional weight is placed on that interior system. And so you get the 1902 Theodore Roosevelt renovation, which adds these massive steel trusses to the upper floors. And then really, I think probably the big thing that really does it in is Calvin Coolidge adds another level and a new roof, again with more modern building materials. We're talking about steel, we're talking about concrete, and all this additional weight is being added on top of the White House, which is primarily stone, brick, and wood. And because the foundational support wasn't there for this additional weight, what you get over time is the White House is sort of slowly collapsing. And what I mean by that is there are these instances of things happening in the White House and they can't really explain what is going on. There are these noises that they hear. Everybody assumes the White House is haunted. I've often thought that this was probably the building literally groaning from some of the weight, and sometimes even sort of the popping of noises in the walls was probably some of those wood interior pieces actually shattering and splitting. And so who's to say there could still be ghosts at the White House, but I do think a big part of it was trying to update the building with more modern materials and just sort of layering that on top of really a 19th century home. And ultimately that's going to lead to the major Truman renovation between 1948 and 1952.
Excellent segue. Robert, when Harry Truman and his family move into the White House, they find some structural difficulties. Can you talk about that and the renovation that follows?
Of course. Well, first of all, when the Trumans moved into the house, Assistant Usher J.B. West referred to it as a rundown Chautauqua hotel. Margaret Truman referred to it as an abandoned hotel. And in fact, it did look like that, mostly because the Roosevelts had been in residence for so long. And as just mentioned, when Eleanor left, she took a lot of the furniture with her because a lot of it had come down from Hyde Park in the first place. The Roosevelts had not spent a great deal of money on the upkeep of the house, especially during the war. They were budget conscious, so they didn't paint inside or outside, which led to the joke that it's actually called the off-white house. So the first thing that they did was slap some paint on the walls, and they made do with what leftover furniture they could find. They cobbled it together. The Trumans moved from their Connecticut Avenue apartment with no furniture. The only thing they brought with them was Margaret Truman's piano. So they thought that painting would be enough, but of course it wasn't. And I'll pick up on the ghost thing. Harry Truman mentioned the ghost in his letters to Bess as he worked alone in his office on the second floor, and he says, "I hear the ghosts, and the ghosts are making the curtains sway." Well, maybe, but in fact, it was the house pulling itself apart. And when they had started with the interior work, when the Trumans first came in, one of the things they found were big cracks running through the wall. And at first the assumption was that those were aesthetic, that was just the plaster cracking. In fact, it was not. And so as they stayed there, it was almost as though the house took its cue and began falling apart on its own. And it was a series of events that led to their awareness of it. One of them that's worth mentioning took place in the East Room. So I want you to use your imagination. There's a grand piano down there, and you can just pick one of these chandeliers. It was in late 1947, Harry Truman had his favorite pianist, Eugene Liszt, playing, and Liszt was set up under one of their chandeliers, and Harry Truman looked up, and the chandelier was going like this. So swinging chandeliers were a harbinger of what was to come. And again, as mentioned, all of the improvements that had been made to the house during the industrial period, you're talking about lead pipe, conduits of every kind, which didn't only add weight. To get these things through, electrical lines, gas lines, they would open up the floor of the wall and cut a hole in the beam or the joist and just patch it up, right? And they figured, well, it's just this one time, no big deal. But if every presidential administration orders these improvements over time, what you get is a Swiss cheese effect. And I don't want to run over time, but I'll just say briefly, the house that James Hoban had designed was entirely suitable for a gentleman of 1800. He did not reckon with the weight that would be added later. So it was a load-bearing structure, and the exterior walls were very thick, and they were on very solid footings. That wasn't the problem. The problem was in the center of the house, where a lot of that load came bearing down. And when the inspection was finally done properly in 1948, which told them just in how much trouble they were in, they discovered that the footings of a lot of those walls, it was just rubble work sitting on sandy ground. And at that time, they estimated that there were 20 tons per linear foot pushing down, yes, on sand. And so you had a house collapsing from within.
Excellent. Well, not excellent. That's actually not excellent at all. Terrible.
I thought it was excellent.
Well, I'm sure, yeah. All right, so we've heard about these architectural changes throughout the years, but I wanted to turn to Patrick and see if the Nixons oversee any structural changes to the White House.
Okay, boa tarde. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. In the house itself, it's less than 20 years old interior-wise because of the changes made by President Truman. So in the residence itself, the designers, Edward Vason Jones and Clement Conger, concentrated on plasterwork. They wanted to improve the plasterwork that had been installed in 1952 and from 1902 as well to make it more 19th century, the same period as the White House was built. So in the green room and the blue room, there were changes to like the plaster cornices and the ceiling medallions as well. So as far as structurally in the White House itself, the residence, there was very little that they could do. I should mention the plaster worker named Adolphe Blaylock from Georgia. He was an excellent craftsman. And sometimes the designer himself, Edward Vason Jones, would climb the scaffolds and help out himself. He didn't mind getting his hands wet with plaster to help out as much as he could. If you talk about structural changes, major changes came about in the Latrobe Hoban west wing, the long terrace that was used for stables and servants' quarters for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. There, President Nixon decided that he would like to get the press itself out of the West Wing. And he looked around at various options, including building a structure between the White House and the OEB, which was canceled. They said no. So he finally landed upon the swimming pool, which he didn't use. It had dated from the time of FDR, and decided to cover that over and create a new press facility. And that was what was done. They did very extensive archaeological work at the time to document what was there. It's very good reading. There are several articles in White House history magazines that can go into that. So that was a major change there. On the West Wing itself, there was the porte cochere added. Am I too French? Porte cochere. It's a covered porch to the front of the building, so that when the president or anyone drove up, they would be covered from the elements. That was the major change. He added 4 Tuscan order bottle-shaped columns to the front of the West Wing, which is still there. And that's about all the major changes that occurred structurally.
Excellent. So now that we've got a bit of a background on the structure of the White House and how it changed over the years, I want to turn to the interiors, more of the decor, and some of the restorations that happened. First, I want to start with Robert. After the house is structurally stabilized and sort of put back together, how do the Trumans go around renovating or decorating decorating the White House? What remains from before the restoration, and what is Bess Truman's involvement?
Well, they didn't have a lot to work with because the appropriation for the renovation itself, and I should say this was a complete rebuilding, they gutted the house. They kept only the exterior walls, which incidentally Bess Truman was very much in favor of and probably had some influence on Harry Truman in advocating. But they built a freestanding structure within the White House, steel beams, and then it was tied in to the walls. So that cost a lot of money. And the appropriation that they got for all of that work, including digging 2 new levels below ground, was $5.2 million. So let's adjust for inflation. That comes to about 72 million or so today. That will buy 1 Osprey aircraft. And just a point of reference, the French just got finished rebuilding Notre Dame. That cost 800 million. So in fact, Congress was quite stingy with the money. The money went for the structural work. There was enough left for the interiors, but that was plasterwork, parquet, this sort of thing. By the time all that was done, there was very, very little left for the family to work with in terms of furnishings. What had happened was the furnishings that had been left after the Roosevelts had all been trucked over to a storage wing at the National Gallery of Art. And we're talking about reproduction pieces. There was very, very little here of true historical merit. And so they went over there and picked out what looked less bad than other things. And they trucked that up to B. Altman and Company in New York, which had the contract for the interior work. B. Altman restained the wood and fixed up the wobbly legs, did some reupholstery, and all that came back down. So Bess Truman, although I want to give her props for this, she said, I don't want to do too much interior work because we're only going to be here for a year. They were in residence, the Trumans, by the time the renovation was finished, the Trumans had less than a year to live in the White House before the Eisenhowers came in. And so Beth, to her credit, said, I don't want to do too much, right? The fact is she couldn't afford to do very much because there wasn't much money left. So what she did was pick out colors, curtains, draperies. She really liked bombastic floral prints, and you see quite a fair amount of that. And then the furniture was a mixture of what had been repurposed and restored. The new things that were purchased were reproduction pieces. If you were to go into Ethan Allen and, ask them for their federal stuff, this is kind of what we're talking about. This is why many visitors to the White House after the Truman renovation said, including Eleanor Roosevelt, she said it looks exactly like a room at the Sheraton, and it did. But what's interesting about the interior work relative to Bess is the spin on the press release that came out right before the interiors were revealed. And I don't know who the PR person is who did this, but hats off. They called it an American interpretation of the Georgian epic. Well, last I checked, Thomas Jefferson didn't have a lazy chair and a Bridgewater sofa. So this was like, vaguely federal, but it was also very much suburban. And when you see the watercolor renderings of it, you see pastels that remind you of the toasters and refrigerators that were coming out around the same time, light blues and purple, well, very light lavenders, say. So Bess actually did have an influence in terms of the fabrics and the colors, but to her credit, she didn't take too heavy a hand because she understood that as soon as maybe Eisenhower got in, she might have some changes in mind, and in fact, she did.
Excellent. So if Bess Truman has more of a restrained approach to the White House, this brings us to Jacqueline Kennedy. Matt, I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about her redecoration of the White House and who she works with, and what impact does she have on the collection overall?
Sure. So, and it's interesting because I think we toss around these words, you know, redecoration, renovation, restoration. You know, Mrs. Kennedy would have probably used the word restoration. And when she talked about it, I mean, that was really how she was talking about this project to the American people, that the White House should reflect the history of the United States. And that includes the incredible cabinet makers, craftsmen, people who've created these pieces that probably never actually were in the White House, but instead the White House should be a stage for those historic examples. And as part of this project, Mrs. Kennedy, she began sort of with a typical Congressional Appropriations Fund for redecorating. I think in her time it was only $50,000, which didn't go very far in 1961. And she worked with Dorothy Sister Parrish to do a lot of the redecorating on the second floor. She expends that money pretty quickly. She hasn't even really touched the state floor. So obviously this is a problem for Mrs. Kennedy. And in part what she does is she creates a fine arts committee for the White House. She works very closely with Henry Francis DuPont, who founded the Winter Term program. And then also she has quite a few allies, friends, acquaintances who are also very much involved with, you know, acquiring American antiques and historic pieces. And so all these things sort of converge together right around the same time that Congress passes a law designating the White House as a museum, and that it should preserve the museum character, and that those furnishings that are in the White House are considered property of the United States. And so you have all of these things sort of happening all at the same time when the Kennedys are in the White House. And so Mrs. Kennedy really seizes this opportunity to remake, restore the White House to be more of this museum interpretation of American craftsmanship. And so she works with H.F. DuPont, she works with Dorothy Parrish, she works with Stéphane Boudon, who was the primary designer, and then a mix of other voices are in there, giving Mrs. Kennedy counsel. And then she also hires the first White House curator, a woman named Lorraine Waxman Pierce, who is assisting and trying to balance all the different demands that Mrs. Kennedy really has. And so, as an add-on to all of that work that she does, the other big part that she does is she really makes it more of a PR, a public relations thing. She hosts a very famous tour of the White House after some of the restoration work is done, and it airs on Valentine's Day, 1962. More than 50 million people will see the broadcast. I know Patrick, I think, was one of the, I think he alluded to that earlier. He was one of the viewers right there. And, but I'll point out that there was a televised White House tour prior to Mrs. Kennedy, and that was President Truman. He wanted to show the American people really what their money had gone toward. And so a First Lady had never given a tour of the White House before. But for Mrs. Kennedy in the age of television, you know, this was the opportunity to put the word out there that she was doing this work, and also really to raise awareness, because then all of a sudden the White House is flooded with people who are saying they have all kinds of, oh, we have examples of this, oh, we have these types of things. So it's actually a pretty ingenious effort on her part to get the word out about the restoration of the White House, but also to solicit, you know, people for potential donations or gifts.
Absolutely. Patrick, in your book, The Nixon White House Redecoration and Acquisition Program, you have this quote that I really love. You say, "If Jacqueline Kennedy brought lilies to the White House, Patricia Nixon gilded them." Can you talk about what you mean by this and a little bit of a comparison between the Nixons and the Kennedys?
I can build on to what Dr. Costello has said, who said it perfectly. There are many schools of thought about how the White House should be restored, redecorated, or whatever. And I think the Kennedy version and the Nixon version were kind of separate and yet eventually came together. I think that the Kennedy aesthetic was the house has its own history and needs to represent its own things that need to come back if they can. But of course, if you wanted to restore the Grant Red Room, it would be impossible because everything's gone. As far as the Nixons were concerned, their major focus was the White House should reflect the very best of American art and design. And the emphasis was on American. That was very much what Nixon thought and what Mrs. Nixon thought as well. So I think that anytime anything was added during the Nixon redecoration, Mrs. Nixon was very careful to say, I'm just adding to this, what Mrs. Kennedy laid down. She was always very cautious about taking a lot of credit. And she did so much. I'm glad that that this is happening now to acknowledge all that she's done. But she was always reluctant to compare herself with Jacqueline Kennedy. So those two schools of thought, should the White House reflect its own history? Should it be invented as long as we bring in the best? And I think that's a struggle that's still going on today in the White House.
Excellent. Pat Nixon works really closely with the White House curator, Clement Conger. Patrick, where was he working prior to the Nixon presidency, and how do this pair meet?
It's a very interesting story. Mr. Conger, Clement Conger, was a Virginia gentleman. He was an assistant chief of protocol at the State Department. And he worked very closely in the State Department to start a collection of furniture, of federal furniture, that the State Department could exhibit. The only problem was that building was a 1960s glass and steel building without kind of a shell to show anything. So working with Edward Vason Jones, he created these colonial interiors with plaster and wood that were incredible. It's the only thing I can say. If you go to visit today, you can still see them. It was a creation of these two. Clement Conger brought in furniture. Edward Vason Jones did all the creation of these wonderful colonial interiors that never existed in colonial America, but it was an attempt to, this is what we could have if we wanted to. It's sort of like a garde meuble that America doesn't have. A garde meuble is a type of organization that collects furniture for historic uses. Most countries have that. We don't have that. So the State Department and the White House are the closest things we have besides museums for that purpose. What he was he was the chief of protocol there. And in the summer of 1969, President Nixon, with kind of a push from H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff, went to visit the State Department rooms. And he was amazed at what he saw and said, oh goodness, this is wonderful. Why don't you come over to the White House and do this for us? And that's how it happened. The previous curator was leaving for the Capitol, James Ketchum. He went on to do wonderful things at the Capitol. And so Clement Conger divided his time between the White House in the morning and the State Department in the afternoon. And he brought along with him Edward Vason Jones. And together they worked through all this incredible recreation of the White House into an all-American version is what I would call it. Being very careful to do everything American that they could. And he worked very closely with Mrs. Nixon. He was very good friends with Mrs. Nixon, and they got along very well together. And I think that was a very good working relationship, including with Edward Vason Jones. Not quite like the Kennedy years, where there was a little tension between the decorators and their different visions of the rooms. They worked perfectly together.
Patrick, can you briefly take us a little bit further into that Pat Nixon decoration of the White House? Where does she start, and what is her approach?
Okay. I was very lucky, I'm going to segue to something personal here, as a boy of 18 to get a job in Washington, D.C. at the Marriott at Twin Bridges. I don't know if it's still there or not. This is over 60 years ago. But I worked at night, but during the day I could visit all the monuments in Washington, D.C., and there was no security then. You could just jump in the line and go through. I think I visited the White House at least twice a week. After a while, the guards would kind of look at me like, what are you doing here again? And I have to look. The Kennedy rooms were still intact at that time. And by intact, I mean the shell was there, but I noticed every chair was worn. There were splits in upholstery. All of the silks on the walls were just buckling and sagging. It looked very, very dingy, even though it was a beautiful shell. And when Mrs. Nixon first arrived, she said, I don't really want to make any changes, but she saw the need for it, that everything needed refreshing. The Kennedys did not order extra materials, and those materials, a lot of them came from France and were very expensive. So, and added to that were the Johnsons were very encouraging of the public to come in and y'all come, y'all sit down. have a seat. Whereas the Kennedy rooms were more like, more attractive to look at than to actually use. That was the purpose. But then in all those years between 1963 and 1969, a lot of wear and tear occurred, as it does every so many years. It's just a lot of work. So when Conger came on board, he was really pushing to remove a lot of the Kennedy touches because he saw that as not American, but more French. Of course, our early presidents always preferred that. Anytime there was a chance to grab French furniture, they would grab it because that's what they preferred. George Washington is famous in 1790 for going to an auction at the French embassy and grabbing everything he could. It was French rather than the Chippendale. And then, of course, Jefferson preferred French and Monroe preferred the French as well. So that part of the White House should be reflected. So they began with the ground floor rooms. I think the Vermeil room was the first. They wanted to get that ready for Tricia Nixon's wedding. And that was a change of color and a different aspect of how the wall should be. The China room followed. The library was another one that came on later. Diplomatic reception room had some changes of furniture. It was essentially the same as Mrs. Kennedy had, but just with rearrangements of furnishings. Upstairs in the main rooms, a lot of repainting, like the East Room and the State Dining Room. The curtains there were relatively new and relatively fresh. But in the Green Room, the Blue Room, and the Red Room, as I've said, and also the entrance hall, it showed a lot of wear. So they really concentrated on those rooms. By 1971, in November, the Red Room was finished. It was more or less as Mrs. Kennedy left it, except the red had changed to more American rose red. The Green Room was changed completely with Duncan Fife furniture. Mostly it was a kind of a showpiece of Duncan Fife furniture. And the Blue Room was given kind of a new look as well with wallpaper, which hadn't been on the walls for over 100 years. So a lot of these changes came about through the pushing of Conger to eliminate the French and make it all more American where he could. Also, the entrance hall was given a new look and more fine American look to it. So upstairs was a different story, and I guess we'll talk about that later. But the program continued after Mrs. Nixon left with Mr. Jones and Conger as well.
Excellent. Switching gears a little bit, we've talked a lot about the interior, but I did want to go back to Bob over here and talk a little bit more about the exterior. You've mentioned it a little bit in the beginning, but what does Pat Nixon do to sort of enhance the exterior of the White House?
Sure, she did one of the most amazing things that is kind of surprising it hadn't been done before. But shortly after she became First Lady, she started to receive some letters from people who had visited Washington and had seen the monuments at night. You know, the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial, all lit up beautifully. The White House was dark, no exterior lighting on the White House. So she decided that she would make that a project straight away. And there was money left over from the money that had been raised privately for the inaugural festivities, the balls and all the rest. And she decided, let's use that money to light the White House at night. So she worked with engineers with the National Park Service, who's responsible for the grounds of the White House. And they devised a lighting scheme. And she wanted to kind of make it a surprise for the president. So one night they were coming back on the presidential helicopter, I think from Camp David or maybe from Andrews Air Force Base. And as they approached the White House, that was dark, all of a sudden, the lights went on and it was illuminated for the first time ever. The president was so thrilled by this that he had the helicopter circle the White House, not just once, not just twice, but 3 times, which was not on the flight plan, I'm sure. But, you know, when the president says, let's circle the White House, the pilot says, yes, sir, and they circle the White House. But, so the lighting of the White House is, you know, now when we think of it now, we assume that it had always been lit. But in fact, it was not lit until 1970, thanks to Pat Nixon. The other thing that was really important is that, you know, under the flag code, when it gets dark, you take the flag down. Well, the flag over the White House by presidential proclamation, once it was lit, now flies 24/7 over the White House. That's been true ever since 1970, when Mrs. Nixon pushed the button in a little ceremony they had on the South Lawn pushed a button to light up the White House for the first time, except for the time that it was lit when the President and Mrs. Nixon circled it. The Marine Band was there playing America the Beautiful, and the house suddenly became lit. It must have seemed almost like that scene in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy lands, you know, in Oz, and it's all in sepia color because of, you know, it was, you know, from that farmhouse in Kansas, which I'm sure never looked as bad as it did in that picture. And then she opens the door, and there's the beautiful Munchkin land, you know, all in vivid Technicolor. And I think that must have been kind of the same effect that people had who had been used to seeing the White House dark at night, only the lights in the rooms and the windows illuminating it, all of a sudden, in all its glory, lit at night, and the American flag flying proudly over the house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year. So that was, you know, the exterior of the White House, Philip mentioned a few things that happened, a few minor things, but the White House has pretty much looked like the White House, with the exception of when President Truman added the balcony on the south portico. But if you look at pictures of the White House from, you know, way back when they first started taking pictures, you go, yeah, that's the White House. But now it can be seen now it can be seen at night, and it really is just a magnificent sight. If you ever get to Washington, be sure to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and look at how beautiful that house looks at night. And then, you know, give a nice thought for Pat Nixon, who thought to do that and accomplished it.
So when it comes to the collection itself, one fun fact that I always like to tell people is that Mrs. Nixon acquires a lot of artwork for the White House collection. More, in fact, than some other first ladies, like Jacqueline Kennedy. This is kind of unexpected. Most people are a little bit surprised by this. I was wondering, Bob and Patrick, and really anyone that wants to hop in on this, can you talk a little bit about Mrs. Nixon's overall impact on the White House collection and maybe highlight some of the pieces that she adds?
Sure, I'll start, if that's okay with Patrick. Mrs. Nixon acquired more than 600 pieces for the White House collection, antiques, of furniture and decorative arts, paintings, and everything else. That's more than any First Lady before or since. And the things that she acquired were really top-notch, first-quality, museum-worthy pieces. Back in 2011, when we were getting ready to open an exhibit in 2012 to commemorate what would have been Mrs. Nixon's 100th birthday, a couple of us went to the White House and met with the curator at the time, Bill Allman. And I remember we were standing in the cross hall, and I asked Mr. Allman, I said, we'd love to borrow for our exhibit a couple of pieces that Mrs. Nixon acquired for the White House collection. And I said, you know, I'm sure there's some things in the warehouse that, you know, you wouldn't mind sending out to California for a few months. And he stopped me short. He said, no. Everything that Mrs. Nixon acquired is of such quality, none of it's in the warehouse, it's all here in the house. But he very generously lent to us for that exhibit back in 2012 a Duncan Fife chair from the green room and a landscape by the American artist George Innes that was called, let me get this name exactly right, The Rainbow in the Berkshire Hills. It was painted in 1869, and we were able to display them here the first time ever that White House furniture was displayed here on the West Coast, and it was one of the jewels in the crown in that exhibit. But again, more than 600 pieces, more than any First Lady for or since, and she was very persuasive in getting people to give things. Often she'd say, could you loan us something? And then after a while, she would say, well, you know, maybe you give it to us, because it works so well here in the house. So she did a great job persuading people to part with things that have been in their family forever, including the Adams family. Two portraits that have been that's Adams with one D. Two portraits of President and Mrs. Adams that have been in the family for more than 200 years. They gave those to the White House. There's some great pictures of her with all of the descendants of President and Mrs. Adams in the room, giving these two portraits that had hung in the Adams house up in Massachusetts for 200 years. Yeah, she was very persuasive.
Excellent. Patrick, anything to add on that?
I think that the Nixon White House depended on a new aesthetic for interiors, for period interiors, kind of espoused by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1970. Barry Tracy, a former Iowan, was kind of the spearheading of that. It was kind of a presentation of making the rooms as pristine and perfect as possible. And Mrs. Nixon, of course, was really on board for that. things that were not available in 1960s for the Kennedys became available in the 1970s, and a whole new aesthetic of looking at these period rooms and making them not only pretty to look at, but also functioning and being able to be to stand the test of time. And I think that should be something that we're very grateful to her. Her eye and the eye of Mason Jones and Conger still exists, really. The green room, the blue room, and the red room have the same curtain designs, although hues have changed a bit, as the Nixon. If she came to the house today, she would recognize those rooms, I think, very much as they were left.
Real quick. William Seal, a great historian of the White House, who wrote this fantastic 2-volume history of the White House. I read it over one summer, and it's really thick. I mean, it would be, enough for 2 doorstops if you wanted to use it that way.
For sure.
It's really good. But he wrote, the Nixon-era was the greatest single period of collecting in White House history. The great collection of White House Americana today is the long shadow of Mrs. Nixon. The impulse, the idea, and the energy were hers. And for a historian like William Seal to say that, I think we can really say, yes, that's exactly right.
Well, and I think I would just add that the earlier panel today talked about sort of the connections between Mrs. Kennedy, Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Nixon, and I've long thought that those 3 women, when we're talking about the creation of the White House collection, the institutionalization of the curator's office, Committee for the Preservation of the White House, and then really, having that teed up for Pat Nixon to really pursue these things, it was really these 3 successive first ladies that really, I think, put the pieces in place, institutionalized it, and then carried it out. Because now there is this expectation with every first lady that has come in, what are you doing for the White House? Not just in addition to your initiatives or to your projects, but what work are you having done in the House? And that has become an extension of that, that those 3 first ladies contributed to.
Excellent. So now that we've talked about the White House, its renovations, structural changes, and all these restorations, and the collection, I want to return to this idea of the White House as the people's house. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, but one of the things that I find really interesting with these big renovations and restorations is that desire to show off the house. So Matt talked in the beginning about that 1962 Jacqueline Kennedy tour. And as he mentioned, there have been some others as well. And what I think is really interesting that all of the people that we're talking about today basically do a televised tour. I was wondering, Robert, if you could talk a little bit more about that Harry Truman 1952 tour. What was sort of the public reaction to it? And I believe Harry Truman does also show off his piano skills in that particular interview. Little fun fact.
Yes. Well, I want to preface what I'm going to say with maybe an antithesis and say that as the White House began to crumble, and literally the cracks appeared and the plaster fell down and the chandeliers were lowered, Harry Truman was conscious enough that this was the people's house, and the first thing he did was close the house to visitors, because he understood that it would have a very negative effect, not only in the perception of the house, but the perception of him. He was getting ready for the 1948 campaign. There had been a lot of terrible jokes about poor President Truman, including "I'm just mild about Harry." And the idea was that, oh, here was a bumpkin from Missouri, and he doesn't know how to live in a mansion, and look, he's wrecked the place. And so, conscious of, obviously, his image, but also the White House's image, as the place began to encounter serious troubles, he shuttered it. So, the television tour, I think that was like a victory lap for Truman, because he wanted to show that the millions of taxpayer dollars that had been set aside for this work was money well spent. And that was really the whole idea of it. I also think it's too bad that he didn't run for office again, although I'm sure Beth would disagree with that, because he showed himself to be a natural in front of the TV cameras, and he was very funny. With Walter Cronkite, who was, then just perhaps not as well known as he would become later, they started out downstairs in the diplomatic reception room, and Truman quipped to Cronkite that the portraits of the presidents that had hung around the room were taken down and replaced with portraits of first ladies. And he said, and now this is 1952, he said, I think the room looks much better with pretty ladies in it. So, goodness gracious. So anyway, he conducted this tour, and in 1952, remember, like, you had commercial television coming out around 1947, 48, and it was adopted very quickly. So by 1952, 1/3 of the houses in the United States had a television set. So this was a major media event. And it was, like I said, good for him politically. As you can imagine, with something as big as the White House renovation, it ran behind, and it ran over budget. And Truman, he applied what he called his curry comb to the architects and engineers and his own commission on renovation to hurry it up, to keep it going, because he wanted to get in the house and live there for nearly a year, because he saw this renovation as his legacy, and so, or at least part of his legacy. And so when the television tour happened, it was like him claiming a ribbon that he thought that he deserved, and in fact, I think he did.
Excellent. Looks like Patrick went down for a second. Hopefully he'll be back. So I'm going to ask about the 1970 Tricia Nixon tour of the White House. What was the purpose of this tour, and what is she showing off?
Sure. In 1970, the folks from 60 Minutes, the TV show, started asking the White House if they could do a televised tour during 60 Minutes. You know, there's an old saying, if you show up at your office one day and 60 Minutes is there, you know you're about to have a bad day. But, but this was actually a good day for it. Mrs. Nixon decided not to do it. She was very judicious in terms of what she chose to highlight in her public appearances. So she asked Tricia, who was living in the White House with the President, Mrs. Nixon, to conduct the tour. Tricia originally said very persuasive, and she finally relented and agreed to do it. So the crew from 60 Minutes showed up, and what they toured were not the staterooms that President Truman and Mrs. Kennedy had shown, but the family quarters up on the second floor, which are never seen by the public